Um, this is one of our seminar series lectures. We started this to try to really inform ourselves and there seems to be so many research projects happening and so much information that's out there that we just didn't know about. And so we started to sort of start this series to really dive into subjects and topics that we're interested in and um, that we thought that our members would be interested in. And a lot of it has been centered around water quality. A lot of it's about research specific to the fishery. But tonight I'm kind of excited because we are talking about a little bit of a different topic, but still fun nonetheless. Actually, I think very fun, actually. And so I'm honored that Casey Butler is here from FWC to chat with us about her research. I was actually able to see a little bit of what I think she's going to show tonight at a recent Sanctuary Advisory Council meeting. And as she was speaking, I thought, wow, I need our members to hear some of this really great research that she's been working on. And so she agreed to come on and share some of her knowledge with us and some of her research with us. And so, Casey, thank you for joining us. And I'd love for you to, before you get started, to give us a little bit of your background and how you got into this, and then jump right into your presentation because I think we're going to love it.
All right, absolutely. And thank you guys for having me. Not everybody wants to hear about lobster pee. Oh, shoot, I
I
gave
do
away.
want to hear about lobster pee.
So yeah, I have been working as a marine scientist for a number of years. I'm also currently working on so I work for FWC. I've been working there for like 13 years, and I now lead the lobster research program as a research administrator here in Marathon. And I'm also working on my PhD at FIU. So I'm going to be talking today about some of the research that we're doing at FWC, but it's also part of it is correlated with my dissertation work at FIU that I've been working on with Mark Butler and Alistair Harborne, who's a fish guy. So I'm kind of transitioning between only lobster and now, more of fishes, which is exciting. So a little bit about me. I am less of a fisheries person by, training and more of an ecologist. And so I've taken my way of looking at a fishery in terms of its ecology. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about that tonight, but the fishery is a big part of what I do as well. So that's what it's going to be all about. Um, and just a little bit more about me. I've been living here in the Keys on and off for 20 or more years. Um, there we go. And I have a couple of small kids. We live in Marathon, and they may run in and totally distract everything. But yeah, so that's me. And yeah, so I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about what we do at FWC and a little bit about what I love, which is lobsters and lobster pee. So within, you guys might think of FWC and immediately come to mind law enforcement, I'm sure. I mean, that's what everybody thinks. But guess what? I don't carry a gun or a badge. I am a nerd. I'm a qualified nerd, and that's about it. But within FWC, we have some structure where we have different divisions. And this is just a very simple way of saying, okay, there is law enforcement, there is resource management. So we've got division of marine fisheries management, freshwater fisheries management, so on and so forth. And then we have the research section. So that's the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, which is based in St. Petersburg, but there's labs throughout the state. And one of the bigger labs is down here in Marathon. And down here in Marathon, we have a variety of scientists working on different projects. And the really cool thing about FWRI is it was created separate from management and separate from, it's still under the umbrella of FWC, but we are independently researching things and providing advice to managers if they want it, but we are doing the research and doing it the right way, regardless of what those management decisions might be. So we don't create any regulations or anything like that, and we don't do any enforcement. But what we do is we have probably 40 or so biologists down here in Marathon, and it's the South Florida Regional Laboratory. We have a couple of Division of Marine Fisheries Management folks now. That's kind of new. We just had them join and be housed down here in Marathon, which is really great because they're the one. It's really important to understand the Keys issues, and living here and seeing it firsthand is great. Because before that, it was all of the DMFM folks were in Tallahassee and in other parts of the state. So the first research group that was housed here in Marathon was the Lobster Research Group. And so that started over 30 years ago, like in the 80s, with John Hunt and then Tom Matthews. We also have a finfish research group, and they do a lot of work with spawning aggregation. So they tag fish and they see where those fish go. They also do a lot of seining to try to understand like the recruitment of small young of the year fishes. We have a restoration ecology group, and they really try to understand the science behind restoration instead of just basically farming corals and sponges. They want to know the best way to do it. We also have coral research where they're doing a lot of monitoring. And so they have these decades long monitoring databases of corals where they can track how these things are changing over time, which is really important. We also have some stone crab research where they're doing monitoring to that directly can inform, fishermen of what the catch is throughout the year, even in the closed season, so they can help try to interpret what that might mean for the upcoming stone crab seasons. We have one sea turtle biologist, and we have one social scientist down here in the Keys. And the social scientist is also quite new to our lab, and that's Dr. May Lemonzeek, and she's great. She's been helping us really pay attention to the social side of our marine fisheries issues and the culture and, the heritage of our fisheries. And, for somebody like me, I really just want to, work with the animals, but working with a social scientist really helps us open our eyes to the other things going on. So it's really great. But this is what we do. Most of the time we're out in the field collecting data, responding to, spinning fish or sawfish or whatever issues, or monitoring. And then when we're not doing that, we're in the office, trying to analyze data, writing up reports, that kind of thing. And before I get any further, because this is the audience that it is, and your eyes and ears are out on the water more than anyone else, any kind of thing that you see that seems off, whether it's water quality or sick fish or anything like that, you can use the fish kill hotline to report that. You can also just reach out and contact me or anyone else at FWC, and we can get you to the right people. Now to my favorite topic. So this is a talk that's going to be about spiny lobsters. And of course, the spiny lobsters have become an icon of the Florida Keys. You drive into Isla Mirada and you see Bertha, a lot of people stopping to take pictures with her. And rightly so, there is an important commercial and recreational fishery for these spiny lobsters here in the Keys. So first, let me just introduce you to the lobsters themselves by talking about their life cycle. So when a lobster has, when the females have eggs and they're ready to release larvae, they hold those eggs underneath their tail. And you see that black thing, that is the spermatophore. And when she's ready, and I love this about females, when she's ready, she will scratch the spermatophore open, and she will extrude her eggs and fertilize the eggs that way. And then she'll hold on to those eggs under her tail for about 4 weeks. And then when she's ready to release them, she'll walk out from the reef into deeper water and release those larvae into the currents. And those larvae will just go, so she's done with her parenting, and those larvae will develop in the plankton for about 6 to 9 months. And during that time, they go through a bunch of different phases. So they start out looking like this. This is a phylosome larva. Philo means leaf-like. So eventually that head part starts to look like a leaf, and they go through a bunch of different stages. But our larvae that end up coming here to Florida are actually coming from all over the Caribbean. And this is a really important thing to note because, you know, our fishery management is based on the stock from other and the reproductive ability of those stocks from other countries like Honduras and Nicaragua, um, Cuba, the Bahamas. Those are some of the big ones. And those blue circles that you see, those are areas where larvae can be retained. So in some of those cases, those lobsters, like especially in the Bahamas, lobsters that are spawned in the Bahamas or released as larvae can end up back in the Bahamas. But in a lot of the cases, they end up just drifting with the currents, and the major currents will bring them up northward and then past the loop current and then past the Florida Keys. And so we get a mix of larvae from all over the place. And like I said, they go through these different stages. And they're eating, you know, they're voracious little predators. They eat zooplankton. They also can hang out on the tops of jellyfish. And as they go through these stages, they start to get new, I call them fluffy, these fluffy little appendages that help them swim better. And they're just super cute. Even though they look like spiders, somehow they're super cute. But when they're ready, and after they've gone through like 13 of these stages, they'll metamorphose into something called the post larva or the puerulus. Puerulus means little boy. And this part of the animal is probably the coolest thing because they are crystal clear. They have the same refractive index as a drop of water. So they do that so that they can go from way offshore in the plankton to miles and swim miles to the nearshore habitat where they want to settle for their nursery grounds. And they seek out and use these different cues. Like they'll use the magnetic orientation of the earth. They'll use currents, wind, chemical cues. As they get closer, they can smell certain algae where they want to settle. And you guys might in particular think this is pretty cool. I couldn't find the picture of the fly, but in the Bahamas, so there's this picture of Mark Butler, one of my research advisors, with one of these on his finger, one of these clear post larvae on his finger. And somebody took that and made a bonefish fly that mimicked it, and it works really well, I guess, for bonefish. So there you go. Oh, there's that picture of that clear post larva. And so one of the things that we do with those is we will monitor how those are how many are coming in throughout the year. So every month after the new moon, because those clear post larvae they try to avoid predators by coming in under the cloak of darkness of the new moon. And so after the new moon, we go out and we monitor two different sites. One is off of Big Pine or Big Munson, and the other one's off of Long Key State Park. And so you may have seen some of these out here. It's a cluster of buoys, and really all it is a frayed rope collector, and it sort of mimics the algae in the hard bottom, and we can count those post larvae. And the reason we can do this is to try to see how that count of post larvae reflects the upcoming fishing seasons to try to see if we can get an index for, you know, a relationship between harvest and the incoming population. And so we finally, after 30 years of doing this, so Tom Matthews started this, and after 30 years, he finally found a relationship. And it's a pretty strong correlation. However, for this database, they had to remove certain years of like hurricanes and things like that, where either we didn't have the data or we either didn't have the data for, you know, certain parts of the peak incoming larvae or whatever. So we're still trying to refine it and make it better able to incorporate all years. But regardless, it's pretty good and it's pretty strong. And one of the really cool things about this is we can use it to say, okay, if there isn't a relationship that's as strong with these years, like maybe we saw a lot of larvae coming in a year, and then 2 years, and by the way, there is a lag time. So once a larva settles, it takes about 18 months for that lobster to reach fishery size, and it's about 2 or 3 years old by the time it becomes mature, reproductively mature. So anyway, so if we see like a lot of larvae one year, but then really low landings, we might investigate to see, were there some post-settlement processes like extra mortality or disease or something like that, loss of habitat that might have reduced those landings. So, and then this is just another look at that. And so one of the trends you can kind of see is there is a slight decline over the years. And that just tells me, we really need to figure out a way to better understand how we can work with management in other countries in the Caribbean that are providing these larvae, to make sure that they're keeping their big mamas that provide more larvae. So after those stages, so that once they settle, they metamorphose once again to a juvenile, and it looks just like a lobster, a little bit different. It has a stripe, but then so they settle in the algae and they eat food in the algae. And once they molt a couple more times, they start to become communal. So they like to aggregate together, and they do that because they're spiny and they can use that safety in numbers approach. So this guy's a little larva we had in the lab. You can see him eating one of his first meals after, those clear post larvae don't even have a stomach because they're so focused on doing just one thing, and that's getting to their settlement grounds, that they don't even have a stomach. So once they settle and they can start eating, then they sure do. So they keep molting until they get, to, and they stay in the near shore hard bottom for however long it takes for them to reach a certain size. And then they start to become more nomadic. And while they're these smaller sizes, they're using size appropriate structures, which they usually find in things like sponges and other structures in the seafloor, like solution holes, or some people call them bay holes, grouper holes, those kinds of things. Once they're big enough, they can go in those. Otherwise, when they're small, they get eaten. And then once again, they make it back out to the reef, and they will reproduce once they make it back out to the reef. So we're talking about juveniles, and we're talking about, they settle in hard bottom. Well, our nearshore hard bottom is this wonderful place. It's so underappreciated. There are wonderful sponges that provide structure. There's all kinds of algae and snapping shrimp that provide cues for lobsters and other species to settle. And so it's essential fish habitat for all kinds of species. And unfortunately, what we've been seeing over the last couple of decades is a decline in our hard bottom habitat communities. And it's been pretty localized, usually from harmful algal blooms, the cyanobacterial blooms, that turns the water pretty green. And what happens is the sponges basically aren't, there's so much mucus associated with these different microscopic algae that it can really sort of start to suffocate the sponges, or at least we think that's what happens. It's still being studied. But anyway, it shuts down those sponges and those sponges die. There's also things like when the water moves with hurricanes away from shore, then that can actually leave those sponges exposed and they die. The heat waves had, the heat wave that we had in 2023 had a drastic effect, not only on sponges, but on gorgonians. And so I don't know if you guys have stuck your head in the water lately, especially near shore, but many of our gorgonians have died. And so it's really just the skeleton of the gorgonian left. And so, seeing this, especially after 2023, we were really concerned that, people have done some studies at the small scale to see how much hard bottom, loss and effects there have been associated with these blooms. But nobody's really done it at scale. So this summer we revisited a study that was done in the 90s where they were looking specifically at, lobster habitat. Where's the hard bottom? And so they just went, for miles and looked over the boat and said, okay, is it seagrass? Is it hard bottom? And then they would do a more thorough examination of the seafloor, and then, what structures lobsters were in. So we revisited these 350 sites this summer. And so this is pretty hot off the presses and still needs a lot more analysis, but there's been some shifts, there's been some changes, and it's not great. So of the 160 hard bottom sites that existed in 1993 and 1994, 60% of those are no longer hard bottom. They have transitioned into things like seagrass mainly, or, some of the what we're calling transition sites. So somewhere between hard bottom and seagrass or sand. So when we define hard bottom, it's usually, oh, it's less than, 5 centimeters of sediment. And it typically allows for things like uh, those gorgonians and sponges to attach to that hard limestone underneath and create those structures. So unfortunately, this kind of loss is not great for our hard bottom habitats that are our essential fish habitat. And so this is just a first look, and our next steps are to look at, what does the loss of structures look like? So we're counting all of we did video transects, and we're counting all of the sponges and the gorgonians that are left in those, and then we're going to compare that to that 1990 study. And we also want to see, where are those little lobsters now? Like, if the habitat isn't as good as it was, if there aren't sponges, and they used to really use those loggerhead sponges specifically at those very small stages, where are those very small lobsters now? Hopefully not trying to live in solution holes, because they'll get eaten, but perhaps they're in the nearby seagrass. So those are some things that we really need to investigate next. And hopefully we'll be doing that next summer, because ultimately these lobsters and fish are now going from something like on the left, where you have all of this structure and you have all of the function of the filtering of the sponges and all of these chemical cues and things, snapping shrimp cues, to being this more barren substrate that really doesn't provide much structure or those cues. So hopefully we can get to a place where, with restoration ecology, that we could get some of these things to come back. But unfortunately, until something changes with water quality, which is what we keep hearing over and over, then that restoration probably doesn't have much of a chance, unfortunately. But sorry about all the doom and gloom. So once lobsters have, reached a certain size and they're starting to be larger and they start to migrate, like this time of year, is usually when the pressure drops, is when the lobsters will migrate away from the nearshore habitats and the shallow waters out to the deeper water. So they'll move west or they'll move south, whatever gets them to the reef. And that once they're at the reef, lobsters have this wonderful ecological role, which is so vague. It's basically, they're predators and prey. And so it's my part of my dissertation to try to understand more about what is their ecological role. What is it about them that helps to move carbon from, different areas, in the bay to the ocean, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, with coral reefs, we know these things are being degraded. It's unfortunate. We've gone from something like 20% live coral cover to less than 2% just in the last couple of decades. And with this loss comes loss of diversity at genetic, species, and functional levels. So, the things that are doing the cleaning, the things that are doing the filtering, all of those functional groups are getting, mixed up, and portions of those are being lost. And so when we start to understand how functional processes like trophidynamics, or understanding the food web, how do you understand how the food web is changing at a coral reef? It's pretty complex. But with the help of a couple of lobsters as lenses, we might actually get a good view of what's happening to the coral reef food web with coral reef degradation. So this is part of my dissertation that I'm working on at FIU with Al Harborn. And the Caribbean spiny lobster, Panurus argus, the one you know very well, is only at the reef for a part of its life. It lives there just in its adult stages and will feed away from the reef at night. Whereas the spotted spiny lobster, Panurus guttatus, which is very cryptic, but very beautiful, love them, but they're also very small. They live on the reef. Once they settle as a post larva, they're there on that same reef pretty much, we think, their whole life. And so they feed directly on the reef at night. So in terms of me being like a nerdy scientist, I think of, when I'm trying to compare the diets of these two and their role in the food web, I think of Argus more as the control. Like, I don't think they're going to change, but I think Guttatus is going to change their diet because they, with the coral reef degradation, because they live on the reef. So what I did for this was We visited reefs throughout the Florida Keys from Key Largo down to Key West and visited 24 different reefs. And when we were at those reefs, we surveyed lobsters, collected lobsters, but we also did a benthic survey where we took photos and then characterized exactly what was on the bentho, so on the bottom. So what corals and algae and everything like that make these up. And then I used that information to help me understand, what is a good reef or a less degraded reef and what is a more degraded reef. And so I'm going to show you what we got back from our lobster diet analysis. So here is just, we're trying to understand using some, nerdy attempts. So we're using DNA metabarcoding, which is really just like, when you take a swab for a COVID test, we do the same thing with a lobster stomach. You swab the stomach. Unfortunately, we have to, dissect the lobsters in order to, or sacrifice them in order to get the gut content. But once we do that, then we can get it analyzed and we can see what they're eating because they eat a lot of soft-bodied things. So just looking through a microscope doesn't tell you the full story. All right, so I'm going to show you this crazy looking diagram, but don't get too freaked out because don't focus too much on the names, focus on the pictures. So I'm going to show you what these animals were eating. So this is all of the different things that came up in lobster stomachs. But I want to show you first, I'll start with Argus, which is supposed to be my control. So for the less degraded, they were focusing on 4 different food groups. So from left top to the bottom, we've got some bivalve clams, we've got some mantis shrimp, we've got porcelain crabs, and some hermit crabs, right? So, a nice diet of crab and mollusks. That's pretty good stuff, pretty high in the in the food web as far as, getting good protein. However, as we start to shift to the more intermediate sites, the coral reefs that weren't as healthy, we start to see that they shift to things that are lower in the food web, like worms, and then also eating crabs that are herbivores. And those herbivores, we don't really want lobsters eating herbivores in a healthy set. I mean, sure, some, but if they're only eating herbivores, then that means that they're taking away the thing that mows down the algae on the reef. And that's not what we want because our reef restoration practitioners are trying to outplant herbivores like the long-spined urchin and the spider crabs out on the reef to do that purpose, eat the algae. So we don't want the lobsters eating the algae, but that looks like what they're doing. And then as we shift to the more degraded, you can automatically see there's just so much more diversity in their gut. And, I automatically think, well, yeah, diversity is great. So this isn't a bad thing, right? But I like to think of it at certain terms of like, you're going out to dinner and you want like a really fine meal and you want your steak and your scallops. But instead, you're facing more of a Golden Corral kind of a buffet and not necessarily getting the high quality food that you really wanted and that your body needs. And so they've shifted to things that are lower in the food web and, definitely some more of those herbivores. So that was our control. And I saw a lot more change in that than I thought I was going to. But for Guttatus, the spotted spiny lobster, let's see what they did. So at the less degraded reefs, they're eating more prey items than Argus did. I think there's like 9 different prey items. So they had some things, they're eating worms, but the worms are fireworms. So those are the worms that eat coral. So if they're eating the things that eat coral, then that's good for the reef. They're also eating some things that are like there was one lionfish that ended up in the stomach, and that could have totally just been a fluke, but interesting nonetheless. They do eat benthic fishes, as you can see here. So things higher up in the trophic level. And then as you shift, we start to see things lower, like brittle stars, more crabs, some smaller items. And then at the most degraded, then they're really focusing on those herbivores, which is not great. So when I look at these two side by side, it's a bit of a mess. It's a little overwhelming, but the major thing that I take away from this is, not only are there both, my control and my, thing that I thought would change are both changing. But the interesting thing is, these two species have co-evolved so that they can live together in a, they can live together in a den. The Argus will be on the bottom of the structure, and then Guettators will be upside down at the top of, a cave or something like that. And so they have these well-defined things so that they aren't over competing for resources like food. And so as we start to see these shifts with coral reef degradation, we're also seeing that their niches, so their specific roles, are shifting and becoming less defined. And that's probably the case for other species of fishes and other things, not only at coral reefs, but in other areas where their native habitat is in decline. So it's kind of cool that we're able to look at these shifts in the coral reef food web just using lobsters, these little cockroaches as an example. But we can also see that, it's kind of reducing their ability to have a high trophic profile. It's hard to, eat those higher grade proteins when you're not given that opportunity. So that was the stuff that I've been working on for my dissertation. And those graphs may still change. Some is more of a draft than anything else, but still those trends are really interesting. So the other part of what I do and what our lobster research team at FWC does is try to understand trends in the fishery by monitoring those trends in landings, but also to try to see if there's anything that we can do to help improve the outlook of the fishery. So in Florida, we have our 3 different sectors. We have the trap sector, we have the dive sector, and we have the bully net sector for commercial. And if you look at that pie chart on the right, you can see that most of the landings go to the trap fishery. It's like 94% of commercial landings are trap based, but then there's about 3% with a commercial dive and about a little less than 2% for bully netters. And that's pretty consistent. The recreational take is around 17 to 20%. And then interestingly, the trap discard mortality, which is just a fisheries term for, the kind of wasted mortality. So, animals that die in lost traps, or animals that die as a result of, being preyed upon in a trap, or, dying from starvation in a trap. And that's interesting because it's about the same amount of take of the population as is recreational. So, there is quite a tax that is being paid by the fishery for the trap discard mortality. And so part of my job is to try to figure out if there's any way to work with the fishery to make it more sustainable and reduce that mortality. Okay, so mentioning recreational because, as Keys residents, it's, quite obvious that we have, and we get infiltrated with recreational lobster fishers every year for many season. So if you look at these graphs, it's really just, the one on the left is really just looking at the number of licenses sold. And so that graph shows you that FWC is really good at marketing licenses. So the blue ones are the ones that are not really geared to lobster. It's more of like the Gold Sportsman and the Lifetime. But the red ones are the ones that are more targeted at lobster fishing specifically. And there has been an increase. So our way of surveying recreational landings isn't great. Our best attempt is by taking we had a mail survey that we used, and we had really good response rates back in the 80s and 90s. And then we have switched to an email survey, and it was really good for a while, but the response rates have started to go down. But we use what we get from those to help understand and to estimate the recreational harvest. And somehow, despite the increase in the number of licenses sold, there hasn't really been a concomitant, increase in the number of harvest for recreational. And so I think that is a valid trend, but there is definitely so much unknown about all recreational harvest. And I think that black box really needs to be investigated for lobster and for other fisheries, because, commercial guys have to report landings, why don't recreational? And that's a big thing that I hear from our fishermen as well. So, while this doesn't show an increasing trend, there may be an increasing trend in recreational fishing, and we really need to sort that out. But during that recreational fishing, as we are all very well aware, we get thousands of people who come to the Keys and they target certain areas. So instead of, you know, going diving over on the ocean side, they dive over on the Gulf side where they concentrate on the contents. So this is for opening day, or no, this is for mini season. And then this graph or this map just shows the only real difference here is about the same on opening day, but it expands, the range expands a little bit. And that may be a result of, either the lobsters moving around or becoming depleted as people are, trying to find that resource. So switching over to commercial landings, like I said, we've got our different sectors. Of course, trap has got the greatest take. And there are ups and downs from year to year. The highest years were in the 90s. Things were looking good in the 90s. We had around 7 million pounds of lobsters landed every year. And then it declined in the early 2000s. And that was at first blamed on the Panulars Argus virus 1. It's just a virus that lobsters can get. But knowing more now, we're not sure that was could be attributed to the disease, but we're not really sure. But either way, there's ups and downs over the years. And let's look at what that means as far as value and price for the fishermen. Because even in years where they're not landing many lobsters, if the price is good, it doesn't matter to our fishermen because they're still making plenty of money. They're buying new trucks. They're having a good year. So if you take a look at the graph on the right, you can see that, price per pound of lobster was pretty stable until the advent of the live market occurred in the late or the 2010s. And once that live market occurred, man, the fishermen were making, banging amounts with the price per pound reaching like $18. But we haven't seen that since then. And so there's a lot more variability in the price. And of course, across the season, the best price occurs in accordance with the Chinese New Year. So, and in the last couple of years, our guys have been having to deal with the exporters messing with the price and fixing the price and not giving them what they were actually due. And so there's all kinds of problems with that sort of thing happening. And our guys, they work their butts off for these lobsters, and they're some of the hardest working people I've ever met. And they are not only hardworking, but they're also really smart. And they've taken what is my favorite thing about lobsters and used it to their benefit. So our fishermen know that lobsters are attracted to other lobsters. They use this as a way of hanging out in shelters together to, try to avoid predation. And they are attracted to other lobsters based on the smell of lobster urine. So lobsters release chemical cues, and everything that they do with their behavior is very much aligned with chemical sensing. So they can tell when there's a predator around. They flick their little antennules, those small paired antennules that they have, and there's a lot of receptors there that can identify what is in the water. And so you can see what I did here is I put their nephropores, their pee holes are right next to their mouth, which is on the underside of their head. And when I put these little plastic tubes just on the outside with some fluorescein dye so that you can visualize that urine flowing from their nephropores, and their little gill rakers create a current so that they're basically sending out an advertisement about all the things associated with that lobster. Is it healthy? Is it ready to reproduce? Is it diseased? All of those things can be communicated within that urine, which is really effective, especially at night when it's harder to see, and that's when they're the most active and they're moving around and looking for shelters. So when they're looking for shelters, they can use that. And if that shelter happens to be a trap, then it's a win for the fishermen. So our fishermen use up to 5 sublegal size lobsters in the traps because they know it works really well. And this bait works better than any live or any other food bait. And this is the only fishery that I am aware of in the entire world that uses this, the target animal, a live target animal as an attractant in the traps. So it's pretty crazy. And they have fewer than 450,000 traps now. So I think it's closer to 440,000 traps. And they're on a trap reduction where it's trying to get down to 400,000, and then revisit whether that number is right or not. But either way, they end up with quite a lot of lobsters in those traps all the time. And typically they'll use the same lobsters for multiple deployments. So they'll have like a 1 or 2 week deployment or even longer, and those lobsters will be in that trap. And unfortunately, if they leave them in there over time and those lobsters don't escape, then often they might succumb to starvation. And lobsters can escape the traps, but in our research, we have found that it's pretty rare. And once there is a dead lobster in the trap, whether it's from predation or starvation, that dead lobster will prevent just the odor of that stinky dead lobster will prevent any other lobsters from entering the trap. And even those other starving lobsters will not eat that dead lobster because it's so repulsive to them and it stresses them out so much. But yeah, so that trap won't catch anything until it no longer smells like a dead lobster. So understanding what it means to be an attractive lobster and that these lobsters can be used for, held in traps for long periods of time, I wanted to understand how that affected their attractiveness because my favorite thing is chemical cues. So with a series of lab experiments and field experiments, we tested how the duration of confinement related starvation might affect their attractiveness. So ultimately, after just, I think, 3 weeks in a trap, they're no longer an attractive bait. And actually, it's more like having a neutral bait or having no bait in the trap. And so understanding this, we really wanted to work with the fishermen because, there's no point in having a bait that's not attractive in the trap, especially if it could die and repel other lobsters. So we wanted to come up with one mechanism, something super simple, especially because working on the back of a lobster boat can be, it's really, everything moves really fast and it's really dangerous. So we don't want to slow them down or, have them have to do any extra work. But we wanted to, evaluate a way that we could say, okay, just by looking at a lobster, I can tell whether it's going to be a good bait based on how healthy it might be. And then we wanted to test that and see if just sorting lobsters might improve their harvest. And then at the same time, it could be reducing mortality in the fishery, that discard mortality. So we wanted to test this with as many fishermen as we could to see how it might work for them. And this is part of a NOAA Salt and Salt Kennedy grant that we had to work with fishermen on this issue. So here's what it looked like when we were doing the reflex testing. It's just like when you go to a doctor and they tap your knee, right? And they try to get that response. So that's what a healthy lobster looked like before on the top. And this one is, of course, not as healthy. So you can see some distinct differences. And we wanted to figure out exactly what aligned with good nutritional conditions. So we have these ways of drawing just a little bit of blood and understanding the blood serum protein. And so we wanted to align that with those reflexes. And the one that we found that worked really well was whether they could hold their tail up on their own. So if they had a strong tail, then they're probably going to pee some good, attractive chemical cues. So use them as bait. And if they can't hold their tail up, then they need a meal. So go ahead and release them to the sea because they're probably not going to be an effective bait and they could even die in the trap and create fewer catch. So what we did was we tried this. We baited traps with either 3 lobsters that were considered, healthy by having that tail strength, or 3 lobsters that were random. They could have been healthy or unhealthy. And we saw a difference. We saw a nice significant difference where it was about 60% greater catch of legals in the traps. But that was just us working with one fisherman. And so we really wanted to get as many fishermen to try it and see how it worked for them. And so we paid as many fishermen as we could get on board with the project and we tested it. We got 3 fishermen. It's been tough trying to get fishermen to work with us after the last couple of decades of, you know, distrust with, with FWC, I guess. But we're working on it and trying to reestablish a better relationship with fishermen. But one of the really cool things about this project is that, here I'm not comparing fishermen A, B, and C to each other because every fisherman fishes differently, different areas, different trap soak duration, different number of lobsters. But what we did was we went with them, we used their baiting technique, we let them bait the trap they normally would, the way they normally would, and then we would also on the traps that we were sorting for that tail strength, all the same number of lobsters they would be using, they just sorted for having that tail strength. And overall, it was pretty cool. We saw an increase in catch, even though some of them it was only 6%. But for some, it was up to 30%. And that's just an increase in each day's catch. And if you think about it, that can be quite a lot of money over the season and a win-win if you think about how not only is it potentially increasing harvest for these guys, but if they are releasing those lobsters and they can survive and, end up back in the trap later, then that could mean even more money for them and a healthier lobster population. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, but didn't really have a slide for, is what is happening with our fishery right now this year. Because most of this project that we've been working on was prior to this July, this fishing season. And this fishing season has been extremely tough on our fishermen because not only do they have the issues of the tariffs causing the price of exported lobster to be really low. They started the season with, a cost of or a price for a pound of $4.50, which if you remember that graph was really, really low in comparison. An average year is usually around $8 an hour or $8 a pound. And 5 is usually the lowest, but they started below the lowest. They also have issues with the export market being open again for the Australians to be able to sell to China. So back when COVID was just, back in 2020, when COVID was announced, the Australian president apparently blamed COVID on China. And so China stopped buying from Australia, which really, and Australia has a huge export market for their spiny lobster. And so that was an advantage for our guys because they were able to fulfill that need in the market. But now this year they just started buying again from Australia. That has been lifted. We also have issues for our guys, of course, with keeping mates. And this year it's even harder because of what's going on with ICE taking men off of boats. So I think one of the things that came up at our last meeting in July was that a lot of the guys were thinking about wanting to get out of the fishery because, times are too hard. They can't pay, the price of traps is getting greater. They can't keep guys working. The costs of, a fishing trip is getting greater. There's also a lot fewer fishermen in the fishery. It's becoming much more consolidated. It's gone from, 600 or more fishermen back in the 80s and 90s to I think around 120, 150 now. So, there's been a lot of change and shift in the fishery. And one of the things that we've been trying to understand working with our social scientists is just, what is their outlook on the fishery? What are their major issues and things like that? So, and I hate to end on such a, depressing note, but I guess I did cover quite a lot of doom and gloom. But yeah, so with that, I would love to take any questions if you guys have any. And my email's on the screen, so you're more than welcome to reach out to me anytime. Love to chat with anyone.
Thank you so much, Casey. If we have anybody that has any questions, you can do it a couple of ways. You can raise your hand and we can bring you up on the panel with us, or you can type it into the Q&A box or into the chat feature. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see those features. And so feel free to type them in now. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes. I have a question while we're waiting to see if there are any questions come through. Casey, I think I saw somewhere that, like in the Northeast, if they come across a female that um, is I don't know, pregnant, is gravid, I guess is the proper term. They have a way of marking them, I think, like a way of marking their tails or something to that nature. Is there something like that here, or I don't think that there's anything like that here. Is there?
No, and there's a reason for that. Our lobsters, if you think back to that graph that had like the currents,
Mhm.
when our lobsters release larvae, they're releasing them and they go northward. And going northward isn't great for our larvae because they end up where in 6 to 9 months, if they drift with the Gulf Stream, they're going to end up, in north, up in the north, like Maine and Canada, or over even in Europe. So most of them don't survive. They become food for something. There is potentially some retention in the Portales Gyre area in the lower Keys, but that has yet to be really resolved. So, that's one of the things, it is not really important to some degree to protect our spawning females because their spawn isn't going anywhere. So that's where, it's more important for us to work with Caribbean and other countries to understand and help them better manage their fisheries if we can.
How long do they live? So what's the lifespan? Do you know?
That's a great question. We think it's somewhere around 30 to 50 years. 30 years is a great guess, but the problem
Wow.
is lobsters don't have, like fish have the ear bone, the otolith, that and trees have rings you can count. Lobsters shed every hard part of their body every time they molt. But there's even a part of their stomach that they molt. But despite molting, they still retain these rings. And so we've just sort of gotten the technique right, and we're able to. Oh no, my children are home. I'm going to put my headphones on. So we're able to. Uh, um, sorry, lost them. Okay. Um, so we're able to understand the age of lobsters better. And we're working on, understanding the age of lobsters that are harvested and the age of lobsters in different locations. And so, yeah, we're getting better at understanding the age. And some of those big lobsters, I want to get my hands on some of those really large ones and see how big they are.
Awesome. I'm wondering if any, I'm wondering if our fish are eating larvae, or if that's been part of their diet, um, ever. Obviously, if bonefish are liking the fly, it makes me think that they are, or they have eaten lobster
Oh,
larvae.
yeah.
But
Oh, yeah.
I am interested, and then I was also kind of intrigued at your food webs of the lobster and of like hermit crabs and those types of things that they were seeming to eat. Because we see a lot of similarities of that, I think, with some of our fish, and that's a little maybe perhaps different than what it used to be. Maybe it's always been a significant part of
Mhm.
their diet, but I think it's interesting, just a parallel there.
Yeah, because I mean, it's just a look, lobsters are one source of understanding how things change. And as far as fish go, grunts are kind of the equivalent of the lobster in the fish world, and so they're really important at moving moving nutrients and food items and things around. And I am sure that the trends that we see with lobsters eating different prey items is likely to, echo throughout all these different fish species that are living on these habitats.
Well, let me make sure that we don't have Jess, I'm not seeing anybody's hand raised. Um, and I'm not seeing any questions. So you might be getting off scot-free, Casey.
Oh, goodness.
No
Well,
questions. You
What a
left us,
shame.
you told us everything we needed to know.
Oh man, I love questions. That's okay. If anyone ends up with questions, you know how to get a hold of me, and I'm always happy to answer them.
You do. I can't thank you enough for sharing your research. It's very, very interesting. Um, I can't wait to see how it continues. I we are
Allison,
yes.
Nick has a question.
Oh,
He's
just a
Yeah.
quick question. Keeper lobster, the 3 inch to the carapace there. How old is one of those, do you think?
They're about 2.5 years old on average, so they're still young. Some of them aren't even mature at that size.
Gotcha.
Nick, have you ever like I mean, has anybody ever seen like a lobster in the belly of a fish before?
Oh yeah.
You have?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely like the grouper, like I've played grouper with lobster in them for sure.
Mm.
I mean, there's all types of stuff that you'll sometimes catch that'll have like lobster antennas sticking out of their throat, muttons, all that stuff.
Gotcha.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
I need to perfect the lobster fly. That'd
Yeah.
be
Yeah,
that would be very cool.
Yeah.
yeah. There's someone. It's the guy who did it is at the Black Fly Lodge, and so I tried to find an. I can get an image out, but I couldn't get one before the talk tonight.
That's all
But
right.
it looks just like that.
That clear lobster.
Yeah, very
Hmm.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We actually, in our stone crab traps, our family stone crab traps, have seen little bitty, like teeny tiny lobster, but they've always had color to them.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Well,
yeah,
sometimes you'll see them like on the ropes. You'll see like the clears and the baby juveniles on the buoy ropes and things like that.
yeah, that really, really cool. So they are reproducing year round.
No, they usually reproduce from April to like August,
Okay,
sometimes longer. Um, you definitely can still find gravid females in traps, throughout the season, but it's rare.
okay.
Usually they try to do it in that time period, but in other areas, like in other areas of the Caribbean, that timing is different. It's probably, not as punctuated depending on temperature.
And I'm just confirming that since our lobster don't originate from here, but they can originate from a few different areas, there's no real way to know exactly where they've come from, right? There's no way for you to know as a
Well,
researcher.
there have been some studies done, and so that's where we know something based on the genetics that have been done. They took the post larvae and compared the genetics of post larvae to those adults
Mhm.
adults that they sampled from all over the Caribbean, and so they do have some understanding of where these things are originating, which is pretty cool.
So where would you say that ours are coming from again? Our,
Those
I mean, our settlers.
Well, we think they're coming mainly from like Honduras, Nicaragua, uh, Cuba, Bahamas. Um, but basically, they could be coming from any of those sources.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for everybody that showed up, and we'll be sure to send this out to. Oh, there is a Q and A in here. Oh, somebody just Leonard just said thank you, Casey. It was fantastic. So, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and sharing lobsters with us. And if we can ever be of assistance to you, we are prepared and ready. We certainly have been thinking a lot about our friends in the commercial fishing industry and the troubles that they've been having and tried to offer our support. There's not often that we can do that, but we've been able to at least try to support them in this time and get the message out. I don't know that we talked about it in specifics, but I didn't realize until I heard it in the SAC meeting that, and I could have it wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something like 80% of the seafood that we eat in the US is imported in. It's on our own seafood.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that the fishermen are trying really hard to figure out if there's some way we can reduce
the amount of imports that are permitted because, you know, those imports of frozen lobster tails from all over the Caribbean are flooding the market for restaurants, so that there's essentially no local market for lobster. And, you know, they're so reliant upon the export market to China that when, you know, when they get hit with these fishermen, or when the exporters aren't buying, or when they're just offering them this terrible price or doing this price fixing that they've been doing, it's, you know, it's terrible for them. So we really need to figure out a way to market, you know, Florida caught live fish and lobster, so that and advertise that perhaps on menus or something like that, so that people know what they're eating and they're willing to pay a little bit more for it.
Yeah.
Because yeah, it's not very sustainable for these guys. And in July, you know, a lot of the guys were talking about wanting out of the fishery. So, and that's the first time I've ever heard that. So, you know, it's kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And keep us posted if there's any news that we need to know. And keep on studying lobster pee. And good luck with getting your PhD. And
Thank you.
keep us posted if we need to know anything or if we can help you in any way.
Thank you so much. And thank you guys all for being the eyes and ears out on the water. Because, you know, that is just so important, that those observations that you guys are able to make, and just understanding, you know, part of my job is just trying to understand what the fishermen know. And, you know, that is such a vital part of our research. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.
You.
Bye bye.
Bye.